The steam from the boiling kettle rose in thick, white plumes, vanishing into the damp chill of the gray dawn. Narendra stood behind the wooden stall, his movements rhythmic and practiced. He reached for a clay cup, filled it with hot tea, and handed it to a traveler without looking up. His fingers were thick and calloused, scarred by years of heat and repetitive labor. The heavy iron wheels of the morning train screeched against the tracks, a jarring sound that vibrated through the platform floor. As the engine lurched forward, gathering speed and pulling the carriages into the mist, Narendra did not turn his head to watch the passengers leave. He stared past the departing train, his gaze fixed on the faint line of the horizon where the sky met the earth. He traced the geography of a country he had only ever encountered in the pages of discarded newspapers, mapping out distant cities in his mind. He wiped the counter with a damp cloth, his eyes never leaving the distance, his mind already miles away from the steam and the clay cups. The station faded into the background as he retreated to the small, cramped room he shared with his mother. Nightfall brought a different kind of labor. He cleared the space on a wooden crate, setting down a stack of newspapers he had scavenged throughout the day. A kerosene lamp flickered on the floor, casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling plaster of the walls. He sat cross-legged, the smell of oil filling the air. He opened a book on governance, his thumb tracing the lines of text until he found the core argument. He pressed his pen down, underlining the passage with such force the paper nearly tore. His eyes burned from the dim light, but he did not blink. He stood up, pacing the 3-foot span of the room, and began to speak to the empty space. He articulated his points clearly, his voice gaining strength, adjusting his tone, refining the cadence of his arguments. From the doorway, his mother watched him in silence. He was not just reading. He was rehearsing for a future that existed only in his mind. He ignored the hunger in his stomach and the ache in his back. The transition from the quiet room to the village lanes was abrupt. Narendra stepped out into the dust, the heat of the day already rising from the packed earth. He did not walk with the aimless pace of a traveler. He moved with the intent of a surveyor. He stopped at the edge of a field where the soil was cracked and gray, the irrigation ditch standing empty, choked with weeds and dry silt. A farmer stood nearby, hands resting on a rusted shovel, his face etched with frustration. Narendra approached and listened. He did not offer empty promises. He pulled a worn-out diary from his pocket, the spine frayed from constant use, and began to write. He noted the depth of the silt and the exact distance from the water source. A few yards away, a group of mothers gathered near a well, speaking of the long miles. Narendra moved to them, his pen hovering over the paper, capturing their words with absolute precision. He asked questions about the terrain and the rainfall patterns. He watched the way they gestured toward the distant, empty buildings. Every complaint became a data point, every frustration a line in his ledger. He was no longer practicing speeches to empty walls. He was building a foundation of evidence, transforming the raw, jagged reality into a structured plan. Narendra stood before the local council, his proposal laid out on a wooden table. He pointed to the sketches of the canal route, his voice steady as he explained the gravity of the irrigation crisis. The council members exchanged glances, then broke into laughter. They dismissed his plan as the naive ambition of an outsider who understood nothing of local governance. Narendra did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He turned his back on the council and walked straight to the village square. He gathered the farmers he had interviewed, showed them the maps, and placed a shovel in the dirt. He was the first to strike the ground. The work was grueling. For weeks, they moved tons of earth under the relentless sun. Narendra worked alongside them, his hands blistered, his muscles aching, his focus never wavering from the path of the canal. He organized the shifts, managed the tools, and cleared the debris that had blocked the flow for years. When the final barrier was broken, the sound of rushing water filled the silence of the valley. The farmers cheered as the liquid reached the parched fields, turning the gray dust into dark, fertile soil. The council members arrived to see the water flowing, their laughter replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. Narendra stood at the edge of the new canal, watching the life-giving stream move across the land. This was his first victory, not won through debate or status, but through the raw, undeniable proof of labor and results. The success in the village did not translate to the capital. Narendra arrived to find a city built on different rules. The corridors of power were narrow, guarded by men who measured influence by legacy rather than results. He walked into the central administrative offices with his files, but the doors remained firmly shut. A secretary took his papers, placed them on a stack of others, and told him to wait. He waited for hours in a hallway that smelled of stale coffee and damp paper. When he was finally granted an audience, the official did not look at his data. Instead, the man leaned back, gestured to the empty chair, and spoke of how the capital had no place for outsiders. Within days, the local newspapers carried stories that questioned his motives. They labeled his village project a publicity stunt and dismissed his methods as amateurish. He walked through the capital streets, hearing the whispers follow him. Every office he visited resulted in the same cold formality. He was an anomaly in a system designed to preserve itself. He stood in the lobby of the main assembly, watching the established politicians move past him, and realized that his real struggle had only just begun. The winter campaign trail turned into a trap on a narrow mountain road. A wall of protesters blocked the path, their voices rising over the howling wind. The car slowed to a halt, trapped between the sheer rock face and the steep drop of the valley. Inside, the air was still, but outside, the crowd grew restless, banging on the metal frame. Narendra reached for the door handle. His team urged him to stay inside, citing the danger of the biting cold and the volatility of the mob. He ignored them. He stepped out, his boots crunching against the frozen gravel. The wind cut through the clearing, but he did not flinch. He walked directly toward the center of the blockade. He did not raise his hands in defense or retreat. He simply stopped, looked at the person closest to him, and asked them to speak. The shouting faltered. He remained there for 3 hours, standing in the freezing air as the sun dipped behind the peaks. He listened to every grievance, every complaint about the lack of resources. He took notes as the temperature plummeted. Slowly, the wall of anger began to thin. The tension that had defined the afternoon dissolved into a structured, calm dialogue. By the time he turned to walk back to his car, the protesters had moved aside. He had used his presence to turn a confrontation into a conversation, cementing his reputation. The mountain road was only the beginning. The years that followed became a blur of motion, a relentless cycle of transit that spanned every corner of the nation. He stopped sleeping in hotels, preferring the sparse, functional rooms of local guest houses where the walls held the echoes of those who came before him. He moved from district to district, his schedule dictated not by clocks, but by the needs of the people he encountered. He crossed rivers on wooden boats, navigated dusty trails on foot, and sat on the floors of village homes to share simple meals. Every day brought a new set of faces, a new dialect, and a new set of problems. He kept his pen moving, documenting the pulse of the country in his worn-out diary. He spent nights reviewing these notes by the dim light of a single bulb, mapping the connections between one region's failure and another's success. He learned the geography of the land through the soles of his boots, and the geography of the people through their stories. There were no weekends, no pauses. He was no longer just a man with a plan. He was a man who had become the bridge between the forgotten corners and the center of power. The era of the notebook was evolving. He realized that personal presence could not be everywhere at once, so he turned his focus to the architecture of the state itself. He found the system clogged with paper, stalled by layers of files that sat gathering dust in dark offices. When he proposed replacing these manual processes with digital tracking, he met a wall of institutional resistance. Officials argued that the technology was too complex, that the infrastructure was too fragile. He did not debate the theory. He bypassed the traditional channels, launching pilot programs that allowed citizens to monitor the status of their own requests in real time. The impact was immediate. Files that once languished for months began to move in days. He built a network where data replaced guesswork, forcing accountability into every corner of the administration. He sat in rooms filled with humming servers, watching the screens as the flow of information finally mirrored the flow of his own ambition. He was no longer just solving problems one by one. He was redesigning the machine to solve them automatically. He had successfully scaled his local solutions to the national level. The heavy doors of the national parliament opened with a low, resonant groan that echoed through the marble hall. He stepped across the threshold. The air here was different still, cool, and smelling of aged paper and floor wax. He did not look back. The memory of the boiling kettle, the steam, and the clay cups at the station remained in the past, a distant point on a map he had already traversed. He walked down the central aisle, his boots clicking rhythmically against the polished stone floor. Every step felt deliberate, a final punctuation mark on a long, winding sentence. He reached his designated seat, a wooden chair that felt remarkably solid beneath him. He did not glance at the other desks, or the faces of those already gathered. He reached out and touched the surface of the desk, feeling the grain of the wood under his palm. It was cold. He sat down, his posture rigid and ready. Before him lay a single thick folder, its edges crisp and uncreased. He reached for it, his fingers steady, and pulled it toward the center of the desk. He adjusted his position, blocking out the ambient noise of the room until only the sound of his own breathing remained. He opened the file. The pages were filled with data, maps, and reports a new set of problems waiting for a solution. He leaned in, his gaze locking onto the first line of text. The noise of the world faded into a dull hum. He was no longer a traveler, no longer a campaigner, and no longer an outsider. He was the architect of the next chapter. He picked up his pen, the metal cool against his skin, and began to read. The work had begun.